didn't have a lot of time left over for their spiritual duties. So, that was additionally a problem. The Bishop of Strasbourg, for example, in 1500, was a Wittelsbach prince from Bavaria who never once preached or heard confession in the 28 years he was bishop. So that's not exactly doing your job. Other problems with bishops, corruptions that were often mentioned at the time, that bishops were often involved in. Simony, the sale of church office. Now, many bishops bought their office. As a matter of fact, we're going to see that Luther's bishop, Albrecht of Brandenburg, bought his position from the Pope for a huge sum of money because he was only 16 years old and he was underage and shouldn't be able to even become bishop, but he pays the Pope off this huge sum and becomes bishop. He borrows the huge sum from the Fugger Bank, and that gets him in all sorts of trouble. But, he just bought his office. And once they bought their office, they considered it theirs, and they considered it something that they could use to make money with, and they considered it something that nobody could tell them how to do it. It was theirs. It was their property, they considered. And so if they didn't want to pursue their spiritual duties, they didn't have to, and nobody could make them. Now, of course, many did, but also many didn't. Another corruption was nepotism, appointing your relatives to church office. This was quite common. Bishops would appoint members of their family to lower church offices. And of course, the Pope did this as well. Pluralism. This was a very common problem. Sometimes one noble would be so wealthy he could purchase several bishoprics all at the same time and, say, be bishop of 5 places at once, which is not good because you can only be in one place at one time. And even if you're dedicated to doing your job, as spiritually speaking, you can still just do it in one place at one time. But, this was a case where the church made money off of it, and it filled offices, and it just continued to do it. But it led to the final corruption complaint of the period, absenteeism. And that was the case where a church official, bishop, or someone else would simply not show up for work. The office would just be empty. Maybe because he's working in some other office he's bought, maybe just because he doesn't want to come to work. And again, there's no real way the church can force the official to actually do his job. So you have all these problems among bishops, as well as you have the problems among the lower clergy. Well, what about the very top of the church? What about the papacy? And here the story is, it's always somewhat different from level to level, but the problems tend to be just as serious. To begin with, in the 14th century, the prestige of the papacy, as you know, was seriously impacted by the Babylonian captivity and then the Great Schism. And it was, again, seriously impacted by the Pope's struggle against the Church Council and the conciliar movement. So popes had to fight their way back from this. And all through the 15th century, they're fighting their way back. They're making deals, as we've seen before and we'll see again, making deals with secular rulers to get control over the church council, to become, once again, the true leader of the church. And by about 1500 or so, on the eve of the Reformation, the Pope has clawed his way back and established himself as the undisputed official leader of the church, and of course major figure in European politics. Unfortunately, the Pope had not regained his position of spiritual leadership, and all through the Renaissance, popes acted in such a way that they did not regain this position of spiritual leadership. So the failure of the church in general to become spiritual leader of the people, or to remain spiritual leader of the people, the failure of the church in general to comfort people when they needed it, to give them guidance, you can see that all up and down the church. You can see it at the bottom because the poor parish priest can't preach, can't teach, can't guide, can't educate, but you see it at the top too, with the behavior of the popes and just the kind of people that the Renaissance papacy was. Now, in many ways, the Renaissance papacy was a splendid affair. Renaissance popes were wealthy. They put on great ceremony. They were politically quite influential. They were, as you'll see, tremendous patrons of humanistic art and learning and the Renaissance culture, but they weren't particularly sensitive spiritual guides for the church. And I'll just give you a couple of examples, 2 or 3 examples of these kinds of popes. Sixtus IV, who was pope from 1464 to 1480, spent most of his time reconquering the papal states. Now, you'll recall that when the Pope went to Avignon in the Babylonian captivity, all the papal states in Italy declared their independence, stopped paying their taxes and dues to the Pope, and the Pope had a severe money crisis. When the Pope went back to Rome, then shortly after that you had the Great Schism, and that took up a number of years of the Church's time and energy. And during this period, the papal states remained independent. Popes were forced to reconquer them militarily one by one. And they do this all through the 15th century, and they really only complete it near the beginning of the 16th century. That, they're out having their military campaign in the field and conquer other militaries and reconquer states and occupy these states one at a time, and there were quite a few of them. So Sixtus IV spent most of his time doing that. When he finally reconquered most of the papal states, he decided to put his relatives in charge of them, which is, of course, an example of nepotism, but he wanted to kind of turn them into a family possession. But he certainly wasn't the worst example. Alexander VI, who was pope from 1486 to 1503, a member of the Borgia family. First of all, he secures his election by the cardinals through bribery, which was not uncommon. Then he moves into the Vatican very openly with his wife and 7 children. And of course, he's supposed to be married even as a parish priest, and here the Pope has got this big family moving in. While in the Vatican as Pope, he has a child with his daughter Lucretia, and this became very well known, and of course was extremely scandalous. He also wanted to make the papal states into a family possession, so he got rid of all the previous rulers and appointed all Borgia family members as rulers of the various papal states. One of the people he appointed was one of his sons. If the Pope were introducing this guy, he would not say, "This is my son." He would say, "This is my nephew." But it's his son. His son's name was Cesare Borgia. And he ruled his papal state so dictatorially and brutally that he became the hero of Machiavelli's Prince. Another son of Alexander, Juan Borgia, was the commander of the papal army and played a big role in military operations in central Italy. But perhaps the thing Alexander is best remembered for is that when he had problems with different politicians, even bishops or cardinals or anybody in the church or secular politicians, he would invite them to dinner, and then shortly after dinner they would drop dead because he was a notorious poisoner, and he poisoned a great many of his political opponents. In the end, he himself, it's thought, met his end by being poisoned. So not a very inspiring example. Another pope, Julius II, Pope from 1503 to 1513, was known as the warrior pope. He fought wars with major European powers such as France, Spain, Venice, and other powers. And the thing that was different about Julius is he didn't fight these wars behind the scenes or from the Vatican. He got on a horse, dressed up in armor, got his sword out, and led the armies in person. So here you got a guy. When you see pictures of him, it's usually he's got a long beard and nice satin clothes and looks very, very much like a pope. But most of the things he did were directed towards military affairs, and he apparently was more of a gifted military man than he was anything else. 2 last examples, Leo X and Clement VII. Both of these popes were from the Medici family. And because they're from the Medici family, they are deeply involved in Italian politics. One of the things they were quite concerned with was restoring the Medici family to power in Florence after the fall of Soderini's Republic in 1512. In fact, the Pope does manage to reinstall the Medici as Dukes of Florence, which they continued to be throughout the 16th century, putting them back in power. But, you know, he spent a great deal of political capital doing that, and of course it distracted him from other things. These Medici popes, however, were tremendous patrons of art and learning. They, in fact, turned Rome into one of the preeminent centers of Renaissance culture. And, you know, it's argued that maybe Venice, Florence, and Rome were the three most important centers for art, especially, but for other kinds of Renaissance culture as well. And there was a great many important humanists working in Rome under the Pope's guidance. Not always doing things that the Pope actually approved of. One case we mentioned just briefly before was Lorenzo Valla, a humanist who worked in Rome under an earlier Pope back in the 15th century, not under the Medici popes. But he was a very important humanist. He was probably the most well-trained humanist in the area of rhetoric and philology of any of the humanists. And in fact, he wrote a book in 1444 called The Elegances of the Latin Language, which became a kind of textbook for Latin rhetoric in the Renaissance. He worked for the Pope. He was a papal secretary. And he did, you know, he wrote speeches for the Pope, he kept records for the Pope, but also what he did was he went into the Vatican Library and knocked around looking at things, and that's when, as you'll recall from an earlier lecture, he discovered or pulled out the donation of Constantine, which was the document the Pope claimed made him ruler over all of Europe. Valla looked at it and found out that its Latin style was a late medieval Latin style, couldn't possibly have been written by Constantine, and therefore was a forgery, a fraud. And the Pope became very upset at that, even though the Pope had essentially paid this man for the activities which led up to this conclusion. Valla also, by the way, claimed that the official church translation of the Bible into Latin made by St. Jerome way back in antiquity, known as the Vulgate translation, was a poor translation and needed to be improved. So, you know, Rome was an important center of humanist learning and Renaissance art and culture, and the Medici popes continued this tradition. The Medici popes built the present-day St. Peter's Cathedral, which is a magnificent church. The Medici popes were patrons of Raphael, of Michelangelo. They loved art, they loved learning, perhaps more than they loved the church and religion. That's kind of a harsh judgment, but if you look at what they did, there is evidence for it. It's under the rule of the Medici popes that Martin Luther gets started in Germany. And they essentially ignore Luther. And this ignoring him for quite a few years until it becomes a really serious situation is one of the reasons why Luther was successful in his Reformation. And you know, the Medici popes were just a lot more concerned with what was happening in Florence than what was happening in Wittenberg. We'll see more about that later. One last thing needs to be pointed out here. That is the fact that during the 15th century, to defeat the conciliar movement, the popes had made deals with the kings of France and Spain, for example, giving them control over the churches in their lands, all local church appointments and church taxes, in return for their support of the Pope as the leader of the church. Unfortunately, no such deal was made in Germany, because Germany was a collection of small states, each with relatively small, poor rulers. And even the emperor, who is their supposed overlord, was a fairly weak figure in many cases. And the papacy just didn't think it would get anything out of such a deal in Germany, and so one was never made. And that means the Pope still directly controlled all church appointments and all church taxes in Germany. All taxes people paid to the church went out of the country, appointments came into the country from Rome, and people in Germany resented this greatly. Princes resented the tax money going out of the country, people resented Italians getting appointed as their bishops and their officials and not knowing any of the local situation. So a great hostility built up in Germany against the Pope and against the church, which you don't necessarily find in France and Spain, where they had more local control over the church.